Intuitionism, W.D. Ross. The reading packet does a fairly good job of presenting the intuitionism of W.D. Ross, so I only have a few brief comments about the reading. As noted in the reading, Ross believes that there are two moral properties, rightness and goodness. And as it states in the reading, Ross does not believe that rightness is reducible to goodness. In other words, I can't define rightness in terms of goodness, nor can I define goodness in terms of rightness. This is something that the utilitarian actually does. The utilitarian says the right action is equivalent to the action which produces the most good. For Ross, this is not the case. Ross says that we can make a distinction between the right action and actions that are good, much in the way that Kant does. So as the reading pack also notes, Ross is trying to integrate utilitarianism and Kantianism. Ross wants morality to be universal, to have universal rules that I must follow, but he also wants to make allowances for the situation, for consequences or the particulars of any individual case. So the rightness of an action and the goodness of an action are two distinct things for Ross. Unlike Kant or the utilitarians, Ross doesn't tell us or doesn't give us a means of determining what's right or good that depend upon some sort of principle. According to Ross, our knowledge of rightness and goodness is something that we intuit. In other words, we know it when we see it. As the reading pack notes on page 17, Ross claims that our experience with such cases puts us in a position to come to know rightness and goodness with the same degree of certainty as we have when we grasp the mathematical truth that a triangle has three angles. So for Ross, morality, or at least a portion of morality, is or revolves around simply recognizing rightness and goodness. According to Ross, we can use these moral intuitions to formulate general sorts of rules that we ought to follow. But for Ross, these rules can't be absolute, because we need to look again at the particulars of any situation. So for Ross, consequences do play a role in our moral decision making. Our intuitions start us along the road of the moral decision by giving us some general rules to follow, but those rules will have to be applied to particular situations, and that's where experience comes into play. Given what Ross has said about intuitions and their role, we can sort of lay out Ross's general approach to morality. Ross believes that we look at particular situations and have moral intuitions. We recognize things that are good and right. From these intuitions, we generate some general moral principles or rules that we ought to follow. Once we've got those rules, the question, of course, is what's the status of these rules? If these rules aren't absolute in some way, then how do we work with them? How do we use them? Well, according to Ross, we need to make a further distinction in these rules. These rules place upon us certain duties or obligations. So once we've established that a rule is moral through our intuitions, then that generates some obligation on our part to do whatever that rule says. According to Ross, we have two types of duties. The first type of duty is my actual duty. That's what I'm actually required to do in a particular situation. Now, according to Ross, we don't always know what our actual duty is. We do, though, know what our prima facie duty, which is the second type of duty Ross talks about. Prima facie means literally at first glance or at first sight. The way Ross has it in mind is in an all things considered sort of notion. So a prima facie duty is the duty we have when we lack all the relevant information. So for instance, lying is wrong. Lying, or a prohibition against lying, is a prima facie duty. Before I know any of the details, I'm going to hold that lying is probably a bad thing to do. Now, in any given situation, even though lying may be my prima facie duty, in my actual duty in a particular situation might be to lie. Ross acknowledges that while prima facie duties may be universal, I shouldn't lie, say, or cheat, or steal, or kill, those are all prima facie, Ross also acknowledges there might be exceptions, that my actual duty might be to do things that we would normally take to be prima facie immoral. So, killing is normally wrong. Ross might say we have a prima facie duty not to harm others. But imagine a situation in which I see two people struggling with each other, and one person stabs the other person. In that case, I might look at the situation and think to myself, prima facie, that individual has done something wrong. They've harmed someone. Now, once I know the details that this person was defending themselves against an aggressor, I might then say, well, in this case, their actual duty was to defend themselves. So prima facie duties and actual duties are sometimes the same. Sometimes what I see and my prima facie duty may coincide. Other times my prima facie duty and my actual duty may not coincide with one another. Once I get all the relevant information and all the details, I recognize that this apparent duty, this prima facie duty, doesn't apply in this situation. The remainder of the reading on Ross's Intuitionism is, I believe, pretty straightforward. Once you understand the distinction between rightness and goodness, that these two are not the same thing for Ross, and the difference between prima facie duties and actual duties, then the rest sort of falls into place. You should be familiar with what Ross takes to be the limited, though not absolute, list of prima facie duties, and how he thinks we should deal with conflicts of duties, which is spelled out nicely on pages 19 through 21. Which essentially look at all of the rest of Ross's theories and the problems with that theory.